Hello everybody, welcome back. Our last week's sessions in this course. Our topic today, 21st century social policy. I'm going to talk about the two countries I know best, England and Germany. Some interesting trends, some worrying trends. Worrying for some people. You can make your own feelings and decisions about this later on in the course of these talks. Kicking off with definitions and backgrounds and a very pretty picture from Wikipedia, of course, of a beetle. And I want to introduce this whole topic by talking about a beetle, maybe the most famous beetle in German literature, maybe the most famous first line of any book written in the German language. So from Chekhov, of course, Franz Kafka. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Uneasy dreams leading to this waking nightmare in that famous story. Our topic is also about transformation, and for many commentators, an unpleasant one, a problematic one. We're going to be looking at welfare state transformation, looking at some 21st century social policy trends and how these impact on social services in the UK and Germany. Before I talk about a changing welfare state, I have to ask a completely separate question. What kind of starting point did these welfare states have before they changed? So what do you know about the welfare states in question today? What can we say about the UK and Germany's social policy traditions? Have the countries similar social policy traditions or different traditions? Discuss with your partner and summarize each country's social policy in a few keywords. And of course, the obvious clue here is Esping Anderson's famous categorization, his typology of welfare states. There you are. Think about that. You can stare at the picture of the German statesman with a very funny pointed helmet. Apparently, he used to wear this helmet even when he was invited to dinner parties. Just imagine sipping soup wearing that helmet. Think about that whilst you think about Germany's welfare state and the UK's welfare state. Pause here. What did you come up with? What can we say about these different traditions? Germany, first of all, what kind of welfare state does Germany have? Well, we named the system after the gentleman, the statesman of the pointy hat, after Bismarck himself. He's Germany's founder, and he's also the founder of Germany's welfare state, which got founded something like 10 or 12 years after Germany got founded. That's a pretty good CV, isn't it? The German welfare state is modelled on the idea of social insurance, obligatory social insurance. And today, whatever it is, 100, 140 years, something like that, after Bismarck created the first social insurances, the principles have hardly changed. I get paid, I look at my wage slip and I can see my social insurance contributions that I pay and the social contributions that my employer also pays. That's very much the principle of Bismarck's system as he conceived it. The system itself is sometimes described as being conservative in as much as it kind of preserves the status quo in society. If a middle class person becomes unemployed, if a middle class person retires, the extent of their payments are related to their paying in before that risk kicked in, so to say. So if you work all your life and you have a middle class job, your pension will be enough for you to retire on. If you're a poor person and you get a pension, you can be quite shocked at just how minimal those payments are. So it tends to keep the differentials in society as they are. And that's one reason why we describe it as being a conservative system. There's other reasons as well. It's notable for its principle of subsidiarity, a tradition of welfare provided by the third sector. So when I say third sector, I mean NGOs, I mean these charities or charitable organizations, non-profit making organizations. And that's a fascinating aspect of German health and social care. If you go to a hospital, it may well be run by a church. You stick your kids into a kindergarten, it may well be a church kindergarten, or a kindergarten from, say, ARVO, or another one of these welfare agencies. Again, your school may also be under the umbrella of one of these organizations too. So it's a fascinating aspect of German social services and German public services in general. They're typically not offered directly by the state, but rather a third sector agency delivers the service. Interesting, huh? The welfare state of the UK really is quite fascinatingly different, especially 30 years ago in Esping Anderson's time. Like the German system, we named the British system after its creator, a intellectual and bureaucrat and civil servant called William Beveridge. He created the system in the middle of World War II, and his ideas were implemented in laws following the end of the Second World War. In terms of its conceptualization, services are primarily financed not by social insurance contributions, but rather by tax contributions. So looking at, say, the National Health Service, it's primarily tax financed. And this is quite interesting and quite a contrast with the social insurance model. Brits do have a national insurance, but it's not at all like the German social insurance system. Sometimes the UK system is described as being liberal. We note that although it provides universal services for everybody in principle, it provides very, very minimum universal services. So there's a very low level of service, and the services are the basic minimal level possible. So minimal but universal security. There's a tradition in the UK of welfare provided by state agencies, which is very, very clear when I was a kid. It's changed a lot in the recent decades, but that's the background. The state would traditionally provide its services. So if you would go to a school or a hospital, that would be a school or a hospital run by the state. So to summarize, two countries with amazingly different social policy traditions. And if we make these categorizations or typologies of social policy, the German and the British system are actually quite fascinating models. You know, if you understand them, you can understand lots of other countries' systems. So an interesting contrast from a teacher's or student's perspective. So different traditions, but common current developments. Germany and the UK, they have very different welfare traditions, but global social policy trends of the last decades is impacted on both places similarly, actually. Both welfare states have seen transformation, really quite rapid transformation, you know, quite spectacular change. One particular powerful ideology in politics must be mentioned here. If I wanted to summarize this trend, this change in one word, I'd probably pick this one term here. Can you guess what's on the tip of my tongue? Neoliberalism. This is the word which describes much of the recent change. So this leads to an obvious question: how on earth would you define neoliberalism? Pause this video, natter with your phone partner. What do you think? How can we define this in a couple of words, in a couple of sentences? Any ideas? Pause here. Neoliberalism, looking on the internet, will give you some quite nice, quite pleasant, compact definitions, and I like this one from the Free Dictionary. A political theory of the late 1900s, of the late 20th century, holding that personal liberty, personal freedom, personal liberty is maximized by limiting government interference in the operation of free markets. Really is an amazingly compact definition. So we're talking about a political theory. It's dated, you know, comes from a particular period, the last part of the last century. So a political theory, a few decades old only. What does this theory hold? If we want to maximize personal freedom, we can do that by limiting, by restricting, by limiting government interference in the operation of free markets. Rephrasing that, saying the same thing in a different way, free markets are good because they maximize personal liberty. The same idea, back to front, so to say. What concrete policies can we draw from this definition? So neoliberalism is about maximizing personal freedom by giving markets freedom. What concrete policies do neoliberal governments typically promote? Again, to give a context to my question and to get you thinking, I'm in my 40s. When I was a kid, a teenager, this was happening in the UK. So I can remember it from when I was like 14, 15, 16, okay, the late 1980s, that kind of time, early 1990s. What was the policies of those governments? You know, how is this neoliberalism expressed in the things that our governments did back then? Natter with your neighbour, see if you can come up with a few bullet points. What did you come up with? I mean, the list is quite easy to put together. Privatization. When I was born in the 1970s, so many things in Britain were actually run by the state. They were owned by the state and run by the state. And they had the word British in the title: British Coal, British Gas, British Telecom for the phone services, British Rail for the trains. So many things were British. Even the car industry had been nationalized. So the government owned a lot of the industrial production in the UK. In the course of the late 1980s, the early 1990s, everything was privatized. Everything that could be sold was sold, or at least, I'm exaggerating here, but at least it felt that way. And I remember being a student, must have been something like 15, 16, and my economics teacher gave us the task of writing an essay: should the government privatize the national rail system? And I remember writing this essay, must have been something like 1990, as a 15-year-old. So privatization, selling off these public services, selling off this public industrial production. Spending cuts is very much a typical policy. Let's save money. We're spending lots of money as a state. That means our tax revenues have to be high. Could we save money? Could we make spending cuts? And especially spending cuts on social welfare. Painful for social workers. Their budgets are going to be under pressure. But also things like libraries, community services like community policing, that kind of thing. Tax cuts, particularly corporate and direct taxes. So tax cuts really were a theme for the Brits in that period too. And I've taken this list from Hayward 2012, also deregulation. So having less regulation, politicians ask themselves, do we need to regulate our economy as much as we are? Could we have, for example, banking deregulation, loosen the restrictions on those organizations doing their thing? That was the kind of question that politicians were asking. The movement's historical roots: where does this ideology come from? We're seeing it in Germany. Is this really a German thing? Is it made in Germany? Does it have German roots? Well, I can give you the answer straight away. Although it is something that we're seeing in Germany, we can consider this to be something that had its origins elsewhere. We can see it as being a kind of import. So most people would acknowledge the roots really are the Anglo-Saxon countries. And again, kind of going back to my childhood, in a sense, I saw it happen. You're seeing two faces here. The gentleman on the left is Ronald Reagan, the American president, when I was something like 5 or 6. And he was the president of America throughout the 1980s. He was very close to Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK, in the same period, the 1980s. So actually, I'm Thatcher's generation. I'm Thatcher, I grew up with those values. What were those values? Celebrating hard work and how that could lead to business profits. Being critical of the state, trying to make the state smaller. The politicians really tried to contract the state. They wanted to have less state. And they would even say so, a leaner state. Lean is a word describing thin or slim. So they were suggesting that our state was somehow out of shape. More steering, less rowing. The state shouldn't do so much stuff. It should have other organizations doing it for it. And finally, the idea of privatizing. I've talked about privatizing industries, which the state owns, but in a more general sense, what can we privatize from public life? For example, public spaces. Could we sell a public space maybe and have some organization running that instead? So there's very much an idea of privatizing the whole public field. That was a theme of my later childhood and my youth and my early 20s. And it really was politicians following on from Reagan and Thatcher that continued that project. The right-hand photo is Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the UK from the late 1990s throughout the early 2000s. And although he came from a different political background, he was also very enthusiastic about this project of embracing the private sector and embracing the private. Good, I'm going to come to a close here. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. Look out for video number 2. Bear with me.